On March 11th, 2014, Dark Souls 2 released. On April 20th, 2014, Matthew Matosis posted a 49-minute video serving as a critique on the game as a whole. Nearly 3 years later, on April 15th, 2017, H-Bomber made a 1 hour and 17-minute defense of Dark Souls 2, most of which was a response to Matthew's original critique. Later that same year, on October 23rd, MauLer created a 9-part series in response to H-Bomber defense. All of this said, why are we here today? Well, we're gonna be responding to that 9-part series. But hold on, don't go anywhere. Don't worry about that video length just yet. We're only focusing on one specific segment. A small one at that. It's a topic that was lightly brushed upon throughout all these videos, and it's a topic that generally gets a passing glance from most that review and play Souls games. And that's PvP.
Many people argue that Dark Souls 2 has the best PvP, and that is absolutely fine, since many of the problems I've mentioned are present in the PvP throughout the games. Therefore, Dark Souls 2 is welcome to be the least smelly poop in the toilet, but it is absolutely still a poop. As for it being fun, please remember the difference between subjectivity and objectivity. I am telling you about the functionality of the thing being terrible, not that your feelings aren't valid. Enjoy the PvP all you want, it's just not well made.
The entirety of MauLer's measured response series totals 493 minutes. That's 8 hours and 13 minutes of content. This is not including the final video in his series that serves as a conclusion to the prior 8 hours of content, of which is another 1 hour and 46 minutes long. Out of all of this content, less than 10 minutes were devoted to PvP. That's 2% of his entire series, and even less if you include the conclusion video. That's less than the fat in some milk. But you see, the reason why we're responding to this segment in particular is because I find that the arguments used within share shocking resemblances to arguments still being used today, primarily by newer players who don't yet understand the online and Souls games or have had sour first impressions. Furthermore, this 10-minute segment is the longest anyone who's not already a PvP nerd has taken a shot at arguing for, or rather against, the idea of PvP in the Souls games that I could find. Understandably, it is too often when critics of the Souls online get berated by the two-worded comment, "get good," when there are many ways to bridge the gap between Souls knowers and Souls newers. This is why I'm responding to a 3-year-old video of a 6-year-old game of a nearly decade-long series. Also, the fact that new game is coming only bolsters the idea that addressing these kinds of arguments needs to be done. I have no doubt that we will see the same comments from the past rehash if new game ends up having PvP, which it will, and we, the community, didn't at least try to defend it. Rest assured, if the next game actually ends up being a cluster bomb of poor design decisions, I'll be right there with y'all whinging at it. But until then, we gotta get through these 10 minutes. So, MauLer wasn't a fan of PvP in Dark Souls 2, or the rest of Soulsborne if we were to take his word for it. Unfortunately for you, I will be hitting up each and every point made up in MauLer's PvP segment in a rather similar way that MauLer did to Harris. Words will be color-coded and all. The first voice you will hear is H-Bomber or Harris. The second, much more deeper voice is MauLer himself, just in case y'all don't know who is who. So without any further ado, let's begin.
PvP is so fun in these games for this exact reason. You're fighting people on the same footing as you with access to the same resources. It's just great.
So he says PvP is so fun in these games. I'm afraid I completely disagree. If we are to take this to mean all phantom battles, be it real people and AI in the game, then yes, as an umbrella assessment, the experience of engaging within it is absolutely horrendous for the majority of the time. But how do I prove that?
And here it comes.
When PvP is functioning well, you'll find that most of the fights will run like you are simply looking for an opportunity to stun lock your opponent until your stamina runs out. Once that happens, you move away, dodge an attack or two, and then repeat the opening step. Sometimes there'll be a parry or a backstab that was tactical, and perhaps you can use the environment to your advantage, but most of the time, especially if you have a weapon suited to dueling, it will end the same way and can be extremely monotonous. This is if it is functioning.
Now, where do I begin? The issue with this entire paragraph is that MauLer presents a description of the PvP gameplay that is both shallow and lacks self-awareness. Shallow in that it removes any amount of nuance, variety, or depth that Dark Souls 2 can claim to have. In some of the clips provided, you can note that MauLer himself is using an S-Stoch. This weapon is considered to be one of the best weapons in the game. It's fast, long, and can deal reliable damage without too much risk given to the player using it. Effectively, it's an R1 machine. If MauLer wrote this paragraph having experienced what the game was like from only wielding a thrusting sword, and the S-Stoch at that, I wouldn't find it hard to believe that R1ing through every enemy can get monotonous. But this is just one weapon from one weapon class from a melee character. What about axes and great swords and great hammers and bows and all the different schools of magic? Furthermore, this paragraph reads more like a book report than a criticism. In the first episode of his series, MauLer does make the declaration that he's viewing Dark Souls 2 with a more objective lens. Thus, it would be on trend to present the PvP in this particular fashion. However, this is where the lack of self-awareness comes in. This paragraph is the anthem of Souls gameplay, PvP and PvE. When you fight a random mob or a towering boss, you are doing exactly as MauLer describes.
You'll find that most of the fights will run like you are simply looking for an opportunity to stun-lock your opponent until your stamina runs out. Once that happens, you move away, dodge an attack or two, and then repeat the opening step.
This isn't a flaw. It's just how the gameplay itself works on a fundamental level throughout the series. In fact, we can boil down almost any game in a similar book report kind of way, devoiding them of any nuance or depth. Take Rainbow Six Siege, for example. When Ubisoft servers are functioning well, you'll find most of the rounds will run like you're simply looking for an opportunity to shoot the other team until you run out of bullets. Once that happens, you get into cover, reload a magazine or two, then repeat the opening step. Sometimes there'll be a bomb plant or a gadget that was tactical, and perhaps you can use the environment to your advantage. But most of the time, especially if you have a gun suited to killing, it will end the same way and can be extremely monotonous. And there it is. There could be more to the game, but this description only goes as far as the one writing it is willing to go. In our case today, we'll be going a little bit deeper. Moving on, let's highlight the last 4 words of this paragraph. Can be extremely monotonous. Anyone can find Souls PvP gameplay in its entirety to be monotonous. Likewise, anyone can find all of it to be incredibly exciting. More often than not, the truth is somewhere in the middle. Not every part of PvP, especially in Dark Souls 2, is going to be enjoyable. But this is largely a case-to-case issue, and I think MauLer recognizes that. Where MauLer is trying to draw the objective line in the sand, though, is in his next point.
The issue here is that the AI within the Phantoms can actually break and get lost, preventing you from using a bonfire and forcing you to either quit or kill yourself, which is awful, but the timeout is so long that you're left with no choice if they lose you, which is very common within the invasions in the gutter especially. Oftentimes, however, the enemies can simply break and forget how to be enemies, making the fights a joke.
Let me start by saying that there's nothing wrong with this point. AIs in Souls games are capable of breaking, though I'd say it's more of an exception rather than a rule. I only have anecdotal evidence, so take my word with a grain of salt. Not being able to progress or sit down at a bonfire because an AI is stuck earlier in the level, like the gutter, for instance, is bogus, and it can happen in Dark Souls 2. I wouldn't argue with this point. What tickles the brain, though, is that one paragraph ago, MauLer mentioned PvP. And yet in this point, he brings up AI invaders, which is, by definition, not PvP. Sure, AI invaders may take the form of a player and perform similar moves to a player, but it is still most certainly AI. NPCs, non-player characters. Thus, this is PvE in disguise, or player versus environment. Sure, MauLer states in his umbrella assessment that all Phantom battles, be them AI or players, are absolutely horrendous, but never in his argumentation does he split the divide. He places both AI invaders and player invaders in the same instance. This may appear like a minor nitpick, but he continues this throughout the rest of his segment. We'll put a pin in this topic for now, but listen, audience, listen to him, and whether or not he differentiates between the two.
The fact is that when they are running as intended, they are placed within your world no matter what is currently happening, and it gives you several moments of being absolutely overrun or overwhelmed. They don't even care if you're dead, they'll be giving you an invasion when they feel it's time. Let's not forget the gimmicky PvP battles from the DLC that are incredibly frustrating to deal with. Enemies that drag you into the depths to simply provide a challenge.
I would know where I need to go. Oh, piss off, no.
PvP will usually find a way to ruin your current run, but if the AI is functioning and it doesn't necessarily interrupt your engagement with other enemies, then it can behave as intended.
Two things here. One, MauLer wasn't consistent with his phrasing of what's intended and what's not when it comes to invasions. At first, he said that it is intentional when players are invaded while under extreme duress, sometimes while they're even dying, and yet later contradicted this by saying PvP only behaves as intended when it's the host and the invader engaging in a 1v1. No other enemies, no other mobs, and no gimmicks like running away. We're looking at you, Maldrin. Which one is it, MauLer? For now, we're going to assume it's the latter. Because if it is the latter, this leads to the second point of contention, the intent of invasions. MauLer directly states that invaders, AI or not, attacking players who are already being attacked by PvE enemies is not intended gameplay. In other words, MauLer stated that PvP in this form is when it is not functioning. So, this is a toughie. It's a toughie because this is a fundamental misunderstanding of how invasions work in Souls and how the greater online operates in Souls. It's in the name, invasion. MauLer even mentioned it earlier. No matter what is currently happening, if you are able to get invaded, you very well can get invaded no matter how unprepared or overwhelmed you already are. The nuance here being that AI invaders are predictable spawns in the world. Even the forlorn AI, who can spawn in multiple places, is still predictable. Players, on the other hand, can invade you anytime and anywhere, so long as you're in an area that can be invaded. In fact, there are items in Dark Souls 2 that can give you a higher chance of getting invaded, or can completely block out invasions altogether. The key word being chance. You very well could never experience a player invasion within hours of gameplay, whereas other players can experience the opposite. This depends on a number of things, and especially the state of your current character. Is your character hollowed? Is your character human? Do you have summons in your world? Did you pop the dried finger item, for instance? To avoid invasions altogether, you could actually burn an effigy at the bonfire to block online interactions for a 30-minute time period. But by doing so, you also can't summon phantoms. Likewise, if you wanted to get invaded more, you can use the delicate string or dried finger to get more invaders into your world. These mechanics point to the idea that random invasions, being a constant threat to the host player, are intended by design. In more recent games in the Souls series, they do give you the option to play offline from the get-go. You can't get invaded this way, sure, but this also means that you can't co-op. It's keeping in theme with the risk-reward gameplay mantra of Souls. You can't have an option without having a certain compromise along with it. And say that a player invader does invade. The rules of engagement are as transient and changing as the game's lore itself. Some Reds will want to kill you as quickly as possible, whether or not you're already engaging with the PvE. Others might wait for a fair fight, as fair as one could be in these games. Then there are a select few who may take pity on you, drop you a few items, lead you through the level, and dip out without so much as touching a hair on your body. Then there could be certain individuals who want nothing more than to see you griefed until you quit the game. Fact of the matter is, invaders and their intentions vary highly from player to player. They may want to play fair, or very well could not. To say that the host being invaded is powerless against their actions isn't a correct assessment either. In Dark Souls 2, hosts can summon up to 3 other phantoms to help overwhelm the invader. The seed of a giant's tree is an item found early in the game that can be obtained several times over a single playthrough that turns the PvE of a level against the invader, if they choose to hide behind them as cover. This is also not mentioning the fact that life gems exist. MauLer devoted the entire first video of his response series on how life gems are so numerous in Dark Souls 2 that it most often nullifies the danger and risk in fighting the PvE. By extension, player invaders can't heal themselves unless using miracles or the warmth pyromancy, which are much riskier to use in the heat of battle versus a host just taking a swig or popping a gem.
PvP will usually find a way to ruin your current run, but if the AI is functioning and it doesn't necessarily interrupt your engagement with other enemies, then it can behave as intended, but Harris describes it as fighting on the same footing. Let me be absolutely clear. These invasions are very rarely fights that could ever be considered fair.
So what I'm perceiving here is that both MauLer and Harris had a misunderstanding, but for totally different reasons. No one yet has made the distinction between 1v1 dueling, as I'm sure H-Bomber Guy was referencing, and random invasions, as MauLer was targeting. This is what was causing the disconnect between the two, because they saw PvP as 2 different standards. In reality, PvP is both. Speaking of which, MauLer then stated that PvP can ruin a host's run when hosts are actually given plenty of incentives to find and destroy invaders, both AI and players. They can be given human effigies from defeating red eye orb invaders, dragon scales from defeating gray dragon spirits, and a number of materials from defeating the bell keepers at the belfries. And there are more rewards from there. It goes without saying that having more of these resources, especially something like a human effigy in Dark Souls 2, is a definite plus. So experiencing invasion doesn't necessarily mean that your time will be wasted. It is instead an opportunity. The effigy you can get from defeating a red can then be used to shut off invasions for the remainder of your time in said level, or used for your own replenishment. On the contrary, runs aren't automatically ruined by invaders popping in. It's down to the host's skill, gear, or even wit to see them through. We'll discuss the ways in more detail, but first, more MauLer.
You will oftentimes find that they deal far more damage than you do. They have far more health than you do. They have access to abilities that you've yet to discover.
Okay, I know what that spell does now. And I'm dead. Oh, Dennis, go fuck yourself.
I really like that aspect to it. It's genuinely something that's cool. You fucked up. That heals you too if you stand in it as well, I think. Oh. What the fuck? More health, please. This is fucking shit.
MauLer declares that invasions are very rarely fair. On its surface level, I would be inclined to agree, but I want to analyze how unfair the examples being shown really are. These 2 clips feature both an AI invader and a player invader respectively. MauLer again didn't make the distinction between the two, but what he did state was that the spells these 2 invaders used were abilities that MauLer and his friend had not discovered yet. Contrary to his point, the Hexer that killed MauLer used Dark Orb, a spell that can be obtained relatively early in the game. This can happen arguably earlier than reaching the Lost Bastille, the level MauLer was in. This is considering if the Hexer went to Huntsman's Copse before joining the Bell Covenant, as seen in the clip. Most of the same could be said for Armorer Dennis, the AI invader in the Iron Keep. Half of his arsenal of spells can be found before this point in the game, whereas the other half is not many merchants away. But yes, being caught off guard by abilities you've never seen before as a player is technically unfair. At least in the first instance when you witness that new ability. After that engagement, one would hope the experience would be edifying enough to teach the player what to avoid the next time they encounter that same ability. This same concept is the basis of the PvE in Souls, that being of trial and error, similar to the point we brought up earlier. You are going to fight PvE enemies and bosses that will have abilities that no other enemy has. Why would an invader shooting a dark orb suddenly fall under such scrutiny? The thing is, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. What's been a staple for Souls games has been the distinct concept that if you see an enemy use a weapon, wear an armor set, or cast a spell, odds are you may also get to use that weapon, armor, or spell soon enough. Seeing Dennis shoot off his spells in such a manner is both a challenge to fight against, but also a promise to the player that you too can get to use such an array of abilities if you so choose. In short, I think moments like these ought to be seen for more than the first encounters would suggest. They might be unfair for those who don't know it's coming, yes, but once they do experience it, a better question would be, how can you one up that? There is another point that needs to be made here about the difference between learning PvE and learning PvP. The amount of exposure between the two environments is largely weighted to one side, and for most, it's not going to be PvP. Most spend the entire game growing their PvE skill, whereas PvP invasions and duels are much rarer if they're not already looking for them. This doubles over when considering the reason why the Hexer was doing so much damage. This is most likely because his build was primed for shooting hexes. Not to mention that he was most likely using a catalyst that was highly upgraded, and the armor that MauLer used was not the best at absorbing dark damage. On a side note, there is a term called twinking in Souls games, where invaders and phantoms keep their levels purposefully low for the intention of being overpowered when fighting against or aiding newer players at the same lower levels. This can be achieved in Dark Souls 2 through the use of the agape ring, which prevents the player from absorbing any souls and thus can keep their soul memory as low as possible. Once this happens, an invader or phantom can show up to a host's world, have a fully upgraded weapon where the hosts themselves most likely don't have anything similar in damage. This can make both invasions and boss fights child play. At least until you start reaching the higher soul memory tiers, then this problem will begin to correct itself. Looking back at this MauLer Hexer encounter, I'm not sure whether this was a moment of twinking or not. The Hexer could very well be bringing a stacked build against a low-level MauLer, or there is the possibility that MauLer's build itself wasn't prepared to tank anything, let alone an onslaught of hexes. The latter point goes only to cement the idea that most players will be fresh and unaware of PvP encounters like invasions and duels since they're such a rare occurrence. For players like MauLer, how would they know how to make their builds for situations like this? The situations they would find themselves in would definitely be unfair, but the next question would be, when will these invasions stop being unfair? The unfamiliarity of spells or getting beaten by somebody who had better numbers on their build ought to be just that, a novelty. It's ultimately down to the player to respec their builds or follow up on questions that they're curious about knowing, especially if they wish to play these games through multiple playthroughs. There is a community of nerds ready and waiting to answer these questions. Speaking of numbers, on average, Red Eye Orb invaders will have less accumulated souls than whoever they're invading. This is thanks to soul memory and how soul memory tiers operate. As long as the host hasn't been consistently losing their souls or putting the points into empty stats, then technically speaking, hosts ought to have more stats in their build than the invaders would. Player invaders, mind you. To answer MauLer's point, the only time when player invaders should have more health than the host is when they simply put more points into vigor than the host did, or most likely wearing equipment like the life ring or the Way of Blue ring, which the host can have access to as well. AI invaders, on the other hand, don't follow these rules. FromSoft knows they can't mimic a real player's intelligence and skill, so they have to supplement that with a copious amount of health for when the AI invader gets hit. And get hit they will. Speaking of which, hosts also have access to NPC phantoms, which have a copious amount of health as well. Hosts aren't always at a disadvantage, it seems.
They have apparently infinite stamina, agility, persistence. They can kill you after they've died, for Christ's sake. And yet, despite all of this, the failing AI, which we will cover, can cost them everything. Someone who's so powerful can be reduced to a fool.
The first sentence here was a bit all over the place. Now, while it is theorized that AI invaders have large stamina pools, or perhaps even an infinite amount, it has also been recorded that AI invaders have set action queues, meaning that they can only activate a certain number of inputs before having to pause and effectively leave themselves open to be attacked. For example, many AI invaders will unleash a barrage of attacks before becoming almost frozen in their tracks once they're done. Other times they might roll 3 times in a row and suddenly have difficulty trying to turn around, leaving them open for a backstab. AI invaders can have all the stamina in the world, but if their queues are over, they can't use that stamina one bit. Infinite agility. This just means that they roll at the same time you're about to attack them. It can't be denied, AIs can read your inputs and roll at precisely the time they need, but infinite agility sounds like they can't be hit at all, which isn't the truth. Infinite persistence? Does this mean poise or aggro range? Either way, they do not have infinite poise. As for the aggro range, they're operating as advertised. Invaders, regardless of AI or players, will typically hunt you down no matter where you go. Finally, the spell MauLer died from here is called Dark Storm. It's a spell that casts circling hexes that surround the caster for a few seconds, basically becoming a blender of damage. He didn't show the start of the cast, but the caster of Dark Storm has to kneel down and pray before the spell activates. This is a glaring tell for anyone who doesn't want to get caught in the blender. When the spell activates, the caster is also completely immobilized during its entire duration. What I assume happened is that MauLer got Navlan, the invader, with an attack just as the spell was activating. Then he got knocked down because the first hexes were able to be sent out, and while getting back up, got hit by the same hexes as they were rotating back around. This has nothing to do with what he says is infinite persistence. This is just how the spell works. Also, there may have been a moment where MauLer could have rolled away from the hexes to safety, as this split frame shows, but I'm going to assume that MauLer thought if Navlan was dead, then his spells would have ceased their deadliness. A good thought, but a fatal error, all the same.
However, even with terrible AI, they survive with incredibly unbalanced healing and health pools. When you are faced with these very common experiences consistently, you may very well end up like a friend of mine who absolutely lost interest in PvP after interactions like this one.
Imbalanced healing. In the provided clip, MauLer showed Hexer Nikolai, an AI invader who can cast both hexes and miracles, much like an actual player can. His healing miracle gives him a considerable amount of health back, but it also leaves him wide open to be attacked, and the clip showed as much. He got backstabbed and punished for said healing. What's further is that Nikolai is the only NPC invader that can heal using a miracle, and is one of the few NPC invaders that can heal, period. Other AI invaders, like Merciless Rona in Huntsman's Copse or the Mira invader in Aldia's Keep, can use Estus, but these charges are significantly nerfed compared to what the host players are capable of. Punishing these healing attempts can be as simple as punishing the miracles with either a backstab or a combo. But let's say they do get the healing off, then this simply resets the fight because the host can heal in return as well. And I have to point this out while we're here. Only AI invaders are capable of using Estus. Player invaders cannot. As said before, player invaders only have miracles and the warmth pyromancy, all of which are extremely punishable, and hosts can even take advantage of warmth for themselves. Moving on, MauLer here was somehow able to sharply transition from talking about AI health pools to a clip that does not feature an AI nor an imbalanced health pool. Actually, the clip doesn't show the invader in question getting hit at all, but let's just watch it.
What? Hello, netcoding. What the fuck? Just give him a little friendly hello. What the fuck is that? That is some fucking bullshit netcoding if I've ever seen it. What is that? What was that? Oh, that didn't hit me. I'm out of range of that. Like, the PvP in this game is shit. I hate that they... Can I make this offline somehow? I don't see how people can defend this fucking PvP. It's so bullshit.
Well, we're here right now, aren't we? What's interesting about this clip is that MauLer found it to be worthy enough to be shown as concrete evidence that PvP does not work. That it is, in fact, bullshit. And yet what this clip actually showed was a newer player getting thrashed and then yelling at the game about it. This player's frustration at losing is not an objective criticism, it's just somebody yelling. But let's dive a bit deeper, all the same. Look at what this player is using. A bastard sword. One of the shortest great swords in the game. Already he's at a range disadvantage. And yet he's yelling at the netcoding as if it's being a disobedient child, when in reality, the invader is simply rolling and backstepping through his short-ranged attacks. And let's not forget to mention the moment he swings not once, but twice when the invader is already out of range, leaving his back wide open to get backstabbed. None of this is unexplainable. None of this is random or unpredictable. This player just got beat by an invader who knew better, and that's it. In this regard, Dark Souls 2 PvP has a bit of a steeper skill floor for newer players, because mashing R1 might work for PvE, but it will not be the definitive answer in PvP. But how could this new player know any better? Like I said, PvE fights and PvP fights are two separate skills to learn. But perhaps the one bit of guidance that I would be able to give here is that you have to approach these kind of fights with patience. And it may not be the most obvious attitude to have, but it would be more productive for a player's time to be patient. What could be a bad first impression could turn into something else later. Alas.
Sadly, if you're invaded by an AI, you can consider yourself lucky, as human invaders will use surrounding enemies against you.
Oh, come on, man. That is not fair. Is this an NPC or is it a... Yeah, it's not an NPC. It's an actual guy. Sigh, sigh, sigh. And he's just gonna wait down there? Because he knows that I have... Oh my god, this guy is such a fucking dick. Yeah, well, that was fun.
She's literally... I can't... There's nothing I can do. She's gonna keep running into further in, so I'm gonna have to keep killing everything first. This is why I play Dark Souls.
Yeah,
There she goes again. Or flee from you at every available moment, healing as much as they can and relying on guerrilla tactics to defeat you, making use of the exploits in the game.
Let me start by saying that invaders have incentives to complete their objective, that is, of killing the host. If this means ambushing said host with the aid of PvE mobs, then that's exactly what it means. Is this always warranted though? It depends on the situation. Oftentimes, invaders will come into a world where a host is aided by a phantom. Co-opers, by the way, have the highest chance of being invaded compared to the hollowed solo hosts out there. And in order to even the odds, invaders would be remiss not to use the environment at their disposal, guerrilla tactics included. This is similar to what the host is already doing, actively using the Phantom's cooperation to overcome the level and its enemies and the eventual area boss. I also have to make a note on this specific clip where Fortin said that this invader was being a dick by waiting at the bottom for him. If MauLer and Fortin were a bit more familiar with the layout of No Man's Wharf, they would know that the only way to Fortin's position would have been to backtrack through the entire level. That's what the red would have to do in order to reach up to Fortin if Fortin decided to stay where he was. They had little alternative but to stay right where they were until Fortin decided to jump down, which he did, missing a jump attack and getting poked.
Yeah, well, that was fun.
There are far too many in the game. In Black Gulch, I was invaded 3 separate times within 10 minutes as I was exploring the area. This can be incredibly frustrating.
I will heavily concur here. Having 2 predetermined AI invaders and the heavy possibility for Forlorn to spawn is too much for a place as small and as condensely packed as Black Gulch. It's hard to disagree with this point, and I wouldn't even say you should. Dark Souls 2's level design in some areas is a fever dream, but different topics, different days.
Perhaps the most frustrating part to all of this is the fact that these things won't even come into play as objective criticisms if the netcode isn't even functioning. You will find that throughout the game, the enemies will be able to perform attacks and critical strikes on you when they had absolutely no chance of doing so from your perspective, because on their screen, I'm sure they pulled it off, but on yours, nothing of the sort was even possible. This gets incredibly ridiculous and shouldn't be something you are forced to deal with.
And I could not agree anymore. We're near the end of MauLer's entire PvP segment, but we finally reached some common ground. However, I think I'm agreeing with a different premise than what MauLer originally intended. If it's not evident to newer players, MauLer referred to Dark Souls 2's netcode being the issue for PvP. But the netcode of Dark Souls 2 isn't actually the issue. If you're already intimately familiar with Souls PvP, you may have recognized some of the examples he showed as being latency. I'll clarify. Latency is what happens when you have 2 stable connections, but both players involved are connecting from separate regions when they are hundreds, maybe even thousands of miles away from each other. From looking at MauLer's YouTube channel description, his location reads that he's a redcoat. Not so sure about the other friends he's included in his clips, but let's assume that they're all European at least. Now, Dark Souls 2 has a cross-region option in its settings. In theory, if this option is placed on restricted, you would only connect with players within whichever region you happen to be playing from. Now we have to ask, how big are said regions? It has been found and tested that Dark Souls 2 regions are enormously lenient. If you're playing on console, North American players can still connect with South American players, even with the cross-region option set on restricted. This means that Canada can connect with Brazil. Meanwhile, MauLer and friends from Europe can still connect with Australian and New Zealand players. I don't have to be the one to tell them that this situation is far from ideal. The only region that can be entirely self-restricted is Japan itself, which, considering the developers this game was made by, it makes sense why Japan gets dibs, but the rest of the world is entirely in disarray. Not to mention that the regions on PC Dark Souls 2 are even more lax. It's like the regions don't exist outside of Japan. Long story short, this cross-region option does little to nothing about preventing long-distance players from connecting to each other, causing noticeable latency. MauLer doesn't exactly call it out, but believe me when I say that the next FromSoft title that features online needs to implement a more structured region lock system, or, in a perfect world, a ping filter. I've talked about this at length in my past videos, but I'll mention it here. Look to Rocket League for an example of a structured region lock system done right. Look to Tekken 7 as an example of ping filtering done right. Souls games need to do this better. That I can wholeheartedly agree with. So while MauLer and friends attributed netcoding as one of the game's faults, it's more likely that the connections involved were from two separate regions. Otherwise, the netcode of Dark Souls 2 is reliable and predictable to play around. The best way I can simplify it is that you and your opponent's actual positions on screen are just a tad behind where you see their phantoms. YouTubers Crag and Scott Jund on YouTube both do a great job at showcasing how the netcode in the Souls games work, particularly Dark Souls 2, and they will help you as a player if you learn from them. This isn't something that's impossible to play around. You can play around this, and you can even get better at managing it. But I suppose that's not necessarily the point. MauLer's original idea was that if this game's online was more well-made, this wouldn't be an issue at all. It would be an objective plus if what you saw on your screen was exactly what the opponents saw on theirs. And in essence, he's right. Fighting games online like Dragon Ball FighterZ, Street Fighter V, and Tekken 7 do this. They try to account for latency by adding artificial delay so that what you see is exactly what the other player sees. Another issue here could be lag. Lag is separate from latency. Lag happens when data packets being sent to the internet are lost due to Wi-Fi or shoddy internet providers. We're looking at you, Comcast. If one side lags in games like Dragon Ball or Street Fighter, due to those specific netcodes, both sides are equally affected, as large numbers of delay frames are added to the gameplay. When this happens, inputs become slower to appear on screen and playing starts to feel generally sluggish, or it very well could just turn into a choppy mess for both players. Meanwhile, in Souls, if the other player is lagging from Wi-Fi, you still have full control over your own character. You can attack, run, or black crystal at your own discretion. But despite this, few folks are going to want to fight a Wi-Fi warrior or someone who's halfway across the world. Souls games, for the most part, fail to stop these connections from happening. That is the objective fault here. The difference is that it's on the implementation of cross-region play and not an issue with the netcoding, as stated by MauLer and Bastard Swordfriend. One more thing before we move on, we need to talk about hitboxes and backstabs. It has been found that weapons have slightly extended hitboxes on their models throughout the games in the series. Dark Souls 2 is no exception. Seeing weapons like the S-Stock and Red Iron Twin Blades hit MauLer in these examples aren't totally out of the question. In fact, him getting hit could mean that he got hit by said extended hitboxes while under latency. It's uncertain. We would have to know what regions both players were from, but I'm sure half of that information is lost to the history of time. Finally, with how the developers of Dark Souls 2 coded the backstab hit confirm, the backstabber doesn't have to hit the opponent's back. They could be facing the punch, rolling into the punch. It doesn't matter. As long as the opponent's body gets the punch, they're going to be backstabbed. Face-stabbing AI invaders is actually incredibly common, and these are offline invasions. Crag on YouTube has another video describing how these backstabs work in detail, and how you can avoid getting backstabbed yourself. All these links will be in the description. In other words, this isn't netcoding, this is backstab coding. To reiterate, you can reliably escape backstabs. You can reliably play around the netcode. If the game is consistent in its mechanics, then you can learn to play around said consistency. When latency and lag are brought into the question, this turns into inconsistency and will rightfully leave a bad taste in the mouths of all parties involved when it happens. But that's the distinction I'm trying to make. Latency and lag are separate from how the game plays when there's none of either.
There is barely anything objective about PvP in the Soulsborne series, whether you're against the AI or human invaders. I happen to think it's utterly crap as a system, clawing at any chance to run properly, but most often doesn't, resulting in absolutely abhorrent gameplay that can fuck up your run or adversely ruin your time with the game. You're welcome to enjoy it, but if you consider it flawless, then you've been incredibly lucky.
What is this? What is this?
Okay, thanks, game.
Could I just run through? Oh my god, just fuck off, will ya?
Many people argue that Dark Souls 2 has the best PvP, and that is absolutely fine, since many of the problems I've mentioned are present in the PvP throughout the games. Therefore, Dark Souls 2 is welcome to be the least smelly poop in the toilet, but it is absolutely still a poop. As for it being fun, please remember the difference between subjectivity and objectivity. I am telling you about the functionality of the thing being terrible, not that your feelings aren't valid. Enjoy the PvP all you want, it's just not well made.
If we were to sum up MauLer's entire argument against PvP, let's start with his strongest points first. Number 1, AI invaders stuck in the level are a huge inconvenience. Very true. Nothing to really argue with here. Number 2, there are too many AI invaders in the game. It is arguable, but you can make a strong case for the Black Gulch being that way. Number 3, Dark Souls 2's netcoding is crap. The issue here isn't the netcoding, it's more of the latency that comes from long-distance connections, of which Dark Souls 2's supposed cross-region play does nothing for. Number 4, invasions are unfair. On the surface, I'd agree, but only if we were considering the very first instances that these invasions happen. I would hope that over time, as the players obtain better gear and experience, they will gain more familiarity with invasions, AI or otherwise. I'm optimistic that they will gain more skill too, but that's another question entirely. Side note, twinking is still a big issue in these games, but over the course of the Souls series, FromSoft has been addressing it more and more. I would hope we'd see a more apprehensive system against it with the new game especially. Number 5, when PvP is quote-unquote functioning in a 1v1, it is monotonous to play. This is, for lack of a better word, subjective. Subjectivity, which I'm sure MauLer is highly aware of, is a quality that we shouldn't argue with each other too intensely about, or else we'd be here for far too long. I mean, there's a time and a place, but for now, let's cool it. In conclusion, MauLer attempted to show that Dark Souls 2 PvP was atrociously made, in order to serve as reasoning as to why it was difficult to enjoy for him and his mentioned friends. Most of the arguments presented, however, were a result from a lack of understanding on the mechanics or misinterpretations of what was intended game design and what was not. However, he was right about one thing. As MauLer stated, enjoy the PvP all you want. It's just not well made. And I don't think a single PvP player, be them duelist, invader, or otherwise, would disagree with that sentiment. Dark Souls 2 PvP is definitely flawed. Not for the reasons MauLer brought up, but it definitely is. All the Souls games and their online are flawed in their own ways. But that's not why folks continue to play Souls online to this day. If other relevant games are any indication, games being poorly made don't necessarily have as much of an impact on whether they're popular or not. Souls Online is not well made. No, there's a lot of improvement still left to go for the formula and its infrastructure. However, Souls Online is something that other game developers in the industry haven't been able to replicate faithfully. It is, in other words, unique. A few other games have attempted to match such an online environment. Dying Light, Watch Dogs 1 and 2, and soon to be Doom Eternal. Thing is, what Souls has been trying to accomplish isn't in it becoming a PvP game, but a game that features PvP. This is similar to the hotly debated topic that the Souls series rides on the laurels of being overwhelmingly difficult, when in reality, it's a bit more complex than that. Matthew Matosis, the one who inadvertently began this Dark Souls 2 conga line, has a video dedicated to this exact topic. It's on Demon Souls specifically, but from watching it, you ought to be able to glean that there's more to Souls than just difficulty and PvP. Souls wanted to be different and distinct. For example, Souls features so many other aspects of gameplay, light RPG mechanics, action-based combat with hints of fighting game inspirations, miles of environmental storytelling latent with an unmistakable atmosphere, and with all of this, it still manages to include online functions that suit its universe. Orange messages dot the landscape with either helpful advice or sinister directions. It also features co-op as a tool players can use if the going gets too rough, or if the road gets too lonely. And yes, it has PvP for those so inclined. One can break down all aspects of Souls down to its cursory parts, but then we'd lose the greater sum of those parts, the whole. The whole of which, for the rest of MauLer's 8-hour series, got ripped into, and rightfully so. Dark Souls 2 has plenty of shortcomings in PvE and PvP especially, but this doesn't mean that Dark Souls 2 and its smaller aspects are completely unplayable or inherently enjoyable. And MauLer does say as much in the concluding video of his series. MauLer even relents that much of the reason he made as long of a series as he did was due to the fact that Harris unfairly represented Matthew's original argument, using his own line of reasoning that neglected glaring issues that anyone who would play Dark Souls 2 would have to face. Thus, that series was just as much of a critique on Harris and his mistakes as it was a critique on Dark Souls 2 and its mistakes. In a similar way, I wanted to address MauLer's arguments on PvP with the same vigor, if you will, because I feel that the disdain for invasions and Souls PvP blinds players who would otherwise find these mechanics acceptable, maybe even enjoyable. The ones left out to dry here are the players who have yet to discover PvP in Souls, the players who don't yet understand PvP in Souls, and the players who will undoubtedly pick up Elden Ring. This video's for them, as much as it may be for MauLer. Lastly, I don't want folks to assume this small segment of MauLer's entire series to be fully representative of its overall quality. It really is only 2% of what his argument was. Even if that 2% was 100% of PvP, I can assure you the series has more merit than this video was able to show. If you stuck around for as long as you have, I would like to thank y'all for watching. You ought to be commended for watching a video from a nerd who was responding to an English nerd who responded to another English nerd who responded to an Irish nerd who was critiquing and basically responding to a game from a bunch of Japanese nerds. Hours of nerds just talking, and it was done all in the name of Dark Souls 2. Outstanding. And that's about it for me. I'm actually rather shook that we're nearly halfway done with this year. For those of us still trucking, the road looks like it ain't gonna get easier soon. But if we look at how far we've come, it wouldn't hurt to stop and take in the view. For now, take care of yourselves out there. Stay safe, stay hydrated, and wash your hands, please.